Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on LGBTQ white people, engaging white people in addressing racism and dismantling white supremacy. My name is Bay Love. My pronouns are he and him, and I'll be the moderator for this evening. But before I go any further, I'd like to introduce our interpreter for the evening, Susan Weinstein. And we also have live captioning thanks to Catherine Zielinski. The captions will be visible along the bottom of the screen, but you can also click the caption link in the description below the video to view them in a separate browser. A little bit of framing, I wanna, and to introduce myself personally, I wanna say that though I'm troubled and saddened by the circumstances that bring us together, I'm also honored to be a part of this important conversation and the other conversation participants and all of you that are watching. I want to get into the evening quickly, but say a few things about myself, sort of as introduction. As I said, my name is Bay Love, and I've been working or striving to be involved in racial justice work for my entire adult life. I started seeing race really for the first time when I was in college, and moved to New Orleans, Louisiana, right after Hurricane Katrina when I graduated. And there I was lucky to be involved in Common Ground, who some of you may know of, as well as the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And most recently, I've been able to train in organizing with a group called the Racial Equity Institute out of Greensboro, North Carolina, and proud to do so. And I've been at least peripherally involved in grassroots and professional LGBTQ organizations since around that same time. So that's a little bit about me. But I want to say a few things also to frame the evening before I introduce the other participants in the conversation. The overarching context for tonight's conversation is this moment. The murders of Black people from racist police violence and other racist violence. George Floyd, Tony McDade, Sean Reed, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Nina Pop, and far too many others. Our focus tonight is on anti-Black racism and our collective belief in the responsibility of white people to be engaged in dismantling white supremacy, engaged in anti-racism, and specifically in talking with other white people. This evening's event was put together at the suggestion of some of the participants of last week's LGBTQ Black Lives Matter Town Hall that was convened by Equality Florida and other Black LGBTQ leaders. And if you haven't seen that, we've linked it in the description and highly, highly recommend that everybody take the time to go watch that town hall as well. You can also, we'll post additional resources on anti-racism and the ways to take action in the video description at the end of this video. We'll say more about framing as we go, but let me introduce the participants in our conversation today. So first we have Shannon Minter, pronouns he, him, from MCLR. Ray Carey, pronouns are she and they, from National LGBTQ Task Force. Mary Bonauto, she, her, from GLAAD. Monica Meyer, she or any, from OutFront, Minnesota. And Ian Palmquist, he, him, from Equality Federation. So we'll hear from each of our participants as we go, but Shannon, I wanted to start with you and see if you would say a little bit more about the purpose of tonight's discussion. Why are we here and what's the purpose?
Yeah, Bay, thank you. Yeah, because we want to be clear about the purpose of this forum. I mean, while we know that many people may be listening, we're talking tonight as white LGBTQ people to other LGBTQ people who are white with the very specific goal of pushing ourselves and other white people to acknowledge the pervasive reality of white supremacy, racism, specifically anti-Black racism, not just out there in the world, but in our own lives and within the LGBTQ movement and community. We take seriously what Black people and other people of color have said, that white people have to take responsibility to deal with our own racism and not expect people of color to do all the intellectual and emotional work to get white people to understand our complicity in racism and white supremacy. So that's the genesis and the purpose of this panel. We just want to stress a few things up front, so I'm going to share these on behalf of the group. First, this is not an anti-racism training, and we are not here because we are experts on anti-racism. We definitely are not. We're also not going to talk about our individual organizations and what we're doing or not doing. That's not our purpose here. We're here tonight because we work in the LGBTQ movement. We want to use whatever voice we have to push ourselves and other white people to be more accountable for our own racism and the ways that we as white people participate in, perpetuate, benefit from white supremacy. So we're not here to distinguish ourselves from other white people or because we claim to be particularly great allies. To the contrary, we're here because we are struggling, because we have repeatedly fallen short, often far short, in addressing anti-Black racism and white supremacy. And we're going to talk about some of those self-imposed barriers that have stopped us as white people from doing that work. Personally, I've made very serious mistakes, range from things like agreeing to be on hundreds of panels that didn't include a single person of color, that did so only in some tokenizing way, to failing to think carefully about whether the way that white people identify issues and allocate resources in my organization, the movement, may be marginalizing, even harming Black LGBTQ people, to largely failing to do anything proactive to address or even acknowledge the pain and harm that so many Black LGBTQ people have experienced as a result of white racism, including my own white racism, inside of queer organizations. It's been just easier to look the other way and avoid the discomfort of talking about my own white identity and all the ways that I benefit as a white person from privileges that are systematically denied to people of color. And when colleagues or others have tried to point out to me ways that I am maintaining or promoting white supremacy, like specific examples, I have usually reacted defensively and from a place of white fragility, or even worse. Sometimes I've used my position to silence viewpoints or criticisms that I just didn't want to hear. So, it's painful to admit these things, but I know it's far more painful to be a Black person harmed by racism and white supremacy. And as Ahmed Ali recently said, I found this really helpful. It's a privilege to learn about racism instead of experiencing it your whole life.
Thank you, Shannon. Ray, let me turn it to you, see if there's anything else you want to add about framing and the purpose of this evening and of this work. And Ray, you're on mute, I think so. Where to hear from you. Oh, great.
Is that better?
Yeah, Ray's back with us. Thanks, Ray.
Can you hear me all right?
You sound great. Go ahead. Just, more framing about this evening, about your own personal experience, work that brings you to this call, and, and what you're hoping folks will get out of it.
You bet. Sorry for the technical difficulties all night. But yeah, Shannon, I really share that experience of acting from a place of defensiveness, or my favorite behavior, shutting down, or not doing something because of fear. And I know that my organization and I specifically have done things or made choices over the years that have been harmful to people of color. And it's my responsibility to listen and to learn and to do better. To own and examine and unlearn the racism and the white supremacy within us as white people is a life's work. And it's also about seeing the larger structural and systemic racism at play that we benefit from as white people. As a white person socialized in the United States, and because of the insidiousness of white supremacist systems, it can just be so hard to see the many ways that I am part of and contributing to uphold those systems, even as I work to challenge them. And so for me, when I choose to be silent, I need to examine how I am upholding the systems and structures that need to change. A number of years ago, when I allowed a local law enforcement official who was, quote, good on LGBTQ issues to speak.
Ray, I think we lost you. Can other folks hear Ray? Lost sound for Ray. Ian, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, Bay.
Let's put a pause on Ray, and Ray, we'll come back to you. You were just sharing about involving, members of law enforcement. So I'll put a pin in that. We can maybe swing back. I wonder if Monica, you've been in Minnesota very much feeling all of this in a sort of up close way. Curious to hear your reflections on framing for the evening in this conversation. And pop off mute, Monica. We'll be able to hear you better.
I'm so grateful to be here with all of you tonight. Minneapolis, Minnesota gained worldwide attention on May 25th when police officer Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd by kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Chauvin casually held his hand in his pocket while he smothered the life out of George Floyd while 3 other officers watched. He continued kneeling on George's neck for minutes after he became unresponsive, and no one rushed to call an ambulance. This disregard for the life of another person is unconscionable, but also heartbreakingly not surprising. Minneapolis is progressive. We have some of the highest voting rates in the country. We elected Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. We are the land of Prince. But racial inequity in Minneapolis is among the worst in the country. In 2010, 28-year-old David Cornelius Smith was tasered and then held down by 2 officers with a knee on his back. David died 10 days later from injuries related to being suffocated. Not only were the police officers exonerated of murder or any punishment, they were commended by the police chief at the time for doing a good job. Since George Floyd's murder, historic weeks of activism and protesting sparked a worldwide uprising against police violence and racism in all 50 states and in 50 countries on every continent except Antarctica. This happened because of activism and work of BIPOC people who continue to put their lives on the line for justice that is delayed and then denied over and over again. We wouldn't be where we are right now without the years of protests led by Black Lives Matter leading up this moment. In 2013, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi created a Black-centered political will and movement in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman. In Minnesota and elsewhere in the country, young Black heroes have put their lives on the line. In Minneapolis, their protests and actions created an environment where those in power had no choice but to arrest and charge all 4 of George Floyd's murderers. And their organizing compelled a veto-proof majority on our city council to commit to re-envisioning public safety in our community. I have so much to learn from these organizers. They've led us to where we are at right now, where most of us white people are joining in and following their lead. It shouldn't have taken this long, and it certainly should not have taken a cold-blooded murder filmed in public in broad daylight and the loss of so many Black lives. Now that we are here, I know I must act with a sustained sense of urgency. This fight against racism and police brutality isn't going to be over at the end of this year or sadly next year. I have to be in this for the long haul. In 2015, after police murdered Jamar Clark, our organization sent out a Black Lives Matter statement with other LGBTQ organizations. At that time, I was surprised by how many people who contacted me pushed back. They said they felt threatened and now they were alienated from our group. I feel so embarrassed to admit that I was surprised by this. I felt safe, seen, and secure in our LGBTQ communities, but didn't recognize until then how little white people talked about race at all, and my responsibility in that. Despite BIPOC communities speaking out over and over again about how unsafe they felt in LGBTQ spaces. At that time, I had just recently learned and started talking about the opportunity gaps in education, housing, unemployment, health, and every other quality of life indicator that existed in Minnesota between Black people, people of color, and then white people. I would mention the gaps, and I would feel pretty good about how I vaguely gestured toward pointing out racism. I would memorize the stats. I actually still do, and I could go a bit deeper if the conversation went there. Recognizing systemic racism is important and good, but for me, I know all of my effort at memorizing stats is an attempt to quell my feelings of guilt about my privilege and lack of action. When I get stuck on what to do, I study. And studying is good, but taking action is what is needed today. That's why I'm here today. I'm ready to do more hard work alongside all of you. I'm scared to make mistakes, but I'm even more afraid of going back to my status quo of concern without enough action.
Thank you, Monica. I want to flip it back to you, Ray, and consistent with what Monica was saying, I think, certainly my own experience as we talked about the conversation tonight, many of us wrestle with being competent in some areas of our lives and feeling grossly incompetent around race, and often making mistakes where we don't even realize until much later the sort of harm that we're doing, even as we're attempting not to do that. So Ray, you were just in the middle of telling us a story about one of your one of the times that you were engaging law enforcement in a particular way that you came back and had some learnings with. So I wanted to tip it back to you, see if we might have you pick up there.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and sorry, folks, for that. What I was talking about was this. We had invited a local law enforcement official who, by the community there in this town in Texas, said, he's great on LGBTQ issues. He should speak from the stage, but we didn't bother to ask what his record was on immigration or his views on policing, and that did harm to Brown and Black people who were there at the conference and far beyond the conference. And some of our immigrant attendees asked to meet with me and some other staff, and we did come up with some action steps, but it wasn't their responsibility to educate me or call that to my attention. And as white people, it's our responsibility to educate ourselves. And I know that there are countless times when I haven't taken the time to ask the questions, or I haven't spoken up, and that silence, my silence, contributes to the perpetuation of violence. And as my friends here have said, we're here tonight to encourage white LGBTQ people to engage in the work of anti-racism and to confront white supremacy as central to our lives and to our desire to build and sustain community, and to the missions of our movement's thousands of organizations. And we're here to say white LGBTQ people are not exempt. And we see this, our whiteness and our racism shows up when white LGBTQ people say they understand what racism feels like because we've experienced homophobia. Or our whiteness and our racism shows up when we say things like immigration or voter suppression or police violence aren't, quote, LGBTQ issues. What does and does not get seen as an LGBTQ issue is a direct result of systemic and structural racism, of which we are a part as white people. And so many of us want to engage, to do something and to take action. And we are at a possible tipping point of really dealing with police violence against Black people. A time in which we may get past just the words and actually change some things. But we have to figure out ways to keep sustained action, not just one-offs here and there. And if not, then we risk our falling apart as a country. And as actually Michelle Alexander wrote yesterday in an op-ed in the New York Times, our democracy hangs in the balance. So if there's one thing that we hope other white LGBTQ people take away from this evening, is we hope it is that it's okay to be afraid, it's okay to fail. The only thing that's not okay is not doing anything to address racism, anti-Black racism, and white supremacy, especially at this moment when Black leaders are calling upon white allies to step up.
No, thanks, Ray. And that you really tipping us to the next point that I'd like to go, because at the Black Lives Matter, the LGBTQ Black Lives Matter forum last night, we heard powerful, presentations from a number of our LGBTQ family. One of the things was that Nadine Smith was very clear to highlight that it wasn't just the violence, against people that sort of caused, this mobilization and some level of consciousness to be spurred, among white people, including white LGBT people, but it was actually like violence that's been happening consistently that was actually shown and demonstrated in a public way because of the ways that it was caught on video and then brought to the public limelight through much of the protest and uprisings that we've been seeing around the country. So important to notice that what it often takes for us to get engaged. And I think as we talk about making mistakes or missteps, the other thing that was so powerful that came through in that town hall is the notion that it's not just mistakes that we make on behalf of other people, mistakes that we damage other people, but the idea that we actually make mistakes that damage our own struggle for our own liberation. And one of the charges, brought to us last week that we'd also like to reiterate here is the question of, do we actually believe and can we actually get to a place where we can see that there's self-interest for us, right, as white people and as white LGBTQ people to end the system of white supremacy. So I want to turn to that notion of, sort of what is our motivating self-interest? Is there such a thing? Ian, I'd love to turn to you to talk a little bit about that. How do you conceptualize that? How does that resonate, or how does that relate to you?
Yeah, thanks, Bay. I think that was such a powerful point that Nadine made. And I mean, first and foremost, racism and white supremacy is just pervasive in every aspect of our lives in this country. And we have a moral imperative to change that on its own. But I think Nadine's question is really interesting and important about what is our self-interest as white people to engage with this. And for me, that's really important because fighting racism isn't some altruistic thing that white people are doing for Black people. It's really very much about fighting for ourselves as well. I've been working in the LGBTQ movement for the last 20 years, and it's become really clear to me that we just can't achieve legal and lived equality for LGBTQ people, for our entire community, without addressing the role that racism plays in perpetuating inequity in our country. And that's not just the impact on LGBTQ people of color, but its impact on white folks as well. Systemic racism is holding us back from winning changes that would improve all of our lives. Time and again, things that would make Americans' lives better have been blocked because many white people and elected officials just aren't willing to pass policies that will help Black people. I'm thinking about health insurance recently. I mean, LGBTQ people who are less likely than other folks to have access to health care. But Medicaid expansion is being blocked by calling it Obamacare and tapping into racist tropes. We're seeing the same thing now with proposals for universal coverage like Medicaid for all. So we're so far behind other rich countries in caring for our own people, and that is, in my mind, 100% because of systemic racism. That's just one of the reasons I personally feel called to engage in this fight. I mean, like my colleagues here, I haven't always gotten it right, and my organization hasn't always gotten it right. I think before I started really looking into this and thinking about race in a new way, I kind of fell into that trap of thinking that racism was about, evil, hateful people. And I knew I wasn't that, so I didn't really think I could be part of the problem. Really have learned that we all have a piece of this puzzle. I mean, even in these last few weeks, I've made mistakes not recognizing the impact that seeing story after story of Black people being murdered was having on my Black friends and colleagues, and I was too slow to step up and support them. So I'm still learning, and I say that not as some act of confession or catharsis, but to share with other white folks that this is hard stuff. We're gonna make mistakes, but the important thing for us to know is that the fear of not doing exactly the right thing cannot keep us from doing anything. And I'm in the discussion tonight because I really want to ask people who are watching this LGBTQ white people in particular, please join us in taking action and stepping up and doing something.
No, thanks, Ian. Mary, this is something that you and I have talked about a bit, you know, sort of the moral imperative and also the self-interest piece of this for white folks. I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts on it. And excellent. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. I want to say thank you for that, Ian, and I'm right there with you, including on the moral imperative. And in addition to being the right thing to do, I very much want to say that this work about ending anti-Black racism, ending white supremacy, is necessary and integral to LGBTQ equality. So at the Black Lives Matter town hall that some folks have referred to, Alfonso David spoke of collective equality, and Nadine Smith noted that rights mean nothing for Black LGBTQ people if they're not free to exercise them. And we haven't arrived at LGBTQ equality when it remains fractured on racial lines. So when you have Black LGBTQ people and others who cannot engage in the activities of everyday living, jogging, sleeping, bird watching, driving, walking, traveling, shopping, voting, so on, without the possibility of being subjected to potentially lethal violence, it's a big problem. It's not equality. And as Imani Rupert Gordon put it at that town hall, think about it this way: we're all better when we're all better. But systematic racism makes it impossible for all of us to be better, makes it impossible to build the strong and inclusive communities that so many of us want, and to get to a really genuine, shared, common good with freedoms and opportunities for everybody. So from my perspective, if LGBTQ people care about equality, equity, and justice, and I think we do, then we have to care about ending white supremacy. And as Nadine put it, either we will have an equitable, multiracial democracy, or we will have chaos. The thing is, the chaos is already on us. The legal rights of LGBTQ people are insecure as long as voter suppression, mass incarceration, and other forms of anti-Black racism are used to keep Black people marginalized politically, economically, and socially. And I ask you, is there not a direct relationship between anti-Black racism and the elections of right-wing, homophobic, transphobic legislators and other officials? Same thing when it comes to the appointment or election of homophobic and transphobic state and federal court judges. So, in my view, challenging anti-Black racism and white supremacy isn't separate from challenging homophobia and transphobia. It's part and parcel of an LGBTQ equality agenda. Now, I say all of this, but I also want to add my voice to acknowledge mistakes. And I have a much longer list that I'm going to speak of tonight. But I think it's important because, again, I want to encourage white people to say it's worth it to join this, even when we make mistakes, and learn from them. So everything everybody said tonight, I resonate with that. I will also say that for me, when juggling a lot of responsibilities, I feel like I have given shorter shrift to really the foundational personal work and the discomfort and vulnerability that comes from really dealing with the systemic privileges I've had as a white woman. It's hard. I've also defended, justified myself with colleagues, with other people who question me, question what my organization has done, about whether we're really serving and advancing the priorities of Black and POC LGBT people. And I want to say I've pushed back in all these ways. With pushing back, I have hurt people. I have missed opportunities. to collaborate, to learn, to strengthen our collective justice movements. And in doing so, I have allowed white supremacy to fester. I also want to say in how I speak about our work, I have sometimes referred to some judicial victories as a win for the principle that we don't have classes of citizens in our country, but we do. And those framings didn't acknowledge the very real class-based lives that Black Americans, for sure, and many, many people of color also endure. So I really ask other white people to join on this journey, to reflect as I am reflecting, which is extremely important work, to get into this marathon of listening and learning with action, even as we're going to make mistakes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary and Ian both. Mary, you brought up a term that I just want to say a little bit about, and that's the idea and the term of white fragility. That was, I think, coined, certainly popularized, I think also coined by Robin DiAngelo. That's another resource that I highly recommend, the book White Fragility. It's small, it's readable, it has a great sort of overview of the history of racism, definitions of structural racism, and also the concept of white fragility. Robin DiAngelo describes white fragility, as essentially how it's meant to capture, she says, how little it takes to upset white people racially. And she notes that sometimes even the notion that we're white, or Mary, as you're pointing out, we often say things like LGBTQ, right? And the assumption is that we're talking about white LGBTQ people, unless we talk about people of color. And the mere pointing that out can raise a kind of defensiveness among white people that she calls white fragility. And I think a key thing about white fragility is that Robin says that it's actually a sort of tactic of social control, if you will, because it's a way that white people sort of, police the discussion, around race and allow us not to have a conversation about whiteness or about white people through the use of our sort of defensiveness and our own, prickliness about the topic. So a lot to say there, but I want to sort of bring this down to the ground a little bit. Shannon, I'd like to turn it back to you. If you could just talk a little bit about the notion of white fragility, your observations about that, both personally, and then also I think as a movement, we can see the ways that white fragility has impacted our organizations and our movement.
Yeah, thank you, Bae. Yeah, I mean, white fragility is a way to just name the fact that white people, including me, tend to just shut down, become defensive anytime someone tries to challenge or even just talk to us about racism and white supremacy. And I think it's important to be really clear that white fragility, it isn't at all about weakness or vulnerability. It's actually a way for white people to maintain our power by shutting down any challenges to it. And, all this is rooted in a fear of being labeled racist. And I certainly have that fear, even though I know in my head that it's a myth that only bad people who do intentionally bad things are racist. Is still, as a white person, it just can be hard to remember that no matter how great my intentions are, of course I'm benefiting from a whole system of white privilege, and of course I'm racist, and that's why it's so important to be in recovery from that and to be, consciously doing anti-racist work. And as you're suggesting, yeah, that applies to organizations. That exact same thing applies to organizations, and as long LGBTQ organizations, and as long as white LGBTQ people are afraid to admit that racism permeates the movement, it permeates our organizations, we're not going to be able to see it as our problem or to make changes that need to be made. And we'll just, if anything, keep asking the wrong question of, is there racism here, when of course there is? And what we should be asking is, like, how is racism operating here, and how can we address it? So, as white LGBTQ people, we just really need to acknowledge that our own white fragility has been a huge obstacle to change, and it's Black LGBTQ people and other people of color who have paid the price and are paying the price. And we're here tonight in part to acknowledge that and hold ourselves and other white people accountable for dealing with our own defensiveness and just working to move past it. And so, as Ian said, we do want to encourage other people, other white people who are watching, to think about how this stuff, the defensiveness and white fragility shows up for you. And we got some links in the resources document to help with that.
Yeah, Shannon, thank you so much. I really appreciate you talking about the way it influences our movements and our organizations. There's also such a personal element. I mean, one of the things that I realized, one of the biggest privileges of being white is the ability to sort of do justice work professionally and then sort of go home and unplug. Whether it's vacation, at the end of the day, that's just not a privilege that my colleagues of color have. So I wonder, Ray, I mean, turn it back to you, if you could talk to us a little bit about that, yes, there's the professional work, but there's also the personal living and the personal work around this. What can you talk to us about the connections there and how that's been for you?
Yeah, thanks, Bae. For me, the personal work and the the professional work are really connected, because it's about an underlying commitment to keep learning and keep engaging, even when I'm afraid. I'll give you an example. So at my organization, we have been meeting for a long time in various identity caucuses and work groups. And I had made it a rule to not attend any of them because I thought my presence as the executive director, my positional power, would affect the conversation with my colleagues. So I didn't participate in our white caucus meetings. And one of my white colleagues called me out, or in really, on what might be behind my opting out. And I came to realize that, yes, my positional power was at play, which in and of itself is a result of many ways society privileges whiteness. But also my own white silence was a privilege I was exercising by being able to opt out. And my opting out of participating in our white caucus gave the impression to some that it wasn't important for other white people to attend and be in relationship with each other. But my opting out and my silence was also really about my avoiding talking about my own racism and my own participation in white dominated systems. And so I started attending our white caucus, and it shifted the dynamics where I think maybe more people started attending at times, and I'm learning from others about ways of furthering my commitment to anti-racism. So by having that space at work, it gives me more language and more perspectives and more practice for talking to other white people in other parts of my life about racism and white supremacy. And so the point to that story is it's to stay in the conversation and in the work. And the point is, yes, it is uncomfortable. And so many of us white people who are left of center often think it's those other white people. Someone earlier talked a little bit about this. It's those other white people who are really the problem, or it's those Trump supporters or something that are really the problem. And that it's just so much easier to point outwards and point to someone else than to own our own roles in the bigger systems of white supremacy. And it's so much easier than to sit in the discomfort and do the work anyway, whether or not that's in our work professional lives or our personal lives.
Thank you. Yeah, Ian?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. I know folks are really hungry to know what they can do to make a difference. And when we talk about dismantling white supremacy, that sounds like this massive, massive task. So this brought to mind, there's a young Black man in Chicago, Jamal Code, who runs a group called My Hood, My Block. And he asks, what is something simple I can do that will have a positive impact on my block? I think that's a great frame to start with. So what is one simple thing I can do to support Black people and other people of color? Where can I be the boots on the ground that Michelle Rayner Goolsbee described in last week's town hall? So as white people, we need to make a habit of thinking about the decisions we make, both big and small. And as we come on each of those, thinking about what are the equity implications of the choices that I'm making? And I'm not just talking about political questions like who to vote for or which policies to support, which are of course important, but also in our daily lives. Like as a manager, how can I change hiring practices to reduce bias? As someone who gives money to nonprofits, could I shift some of the money I'm giving to organizations that are led by people of color? And if I'm planning a community event or some kind of gathering, how can I make sure that it's welcoming and accessible for people from different economic, racial, and cultural backgrounds? And just to give a few examples of ways to take action in this moment, and there are many more in the resource document linked in the description, but I want to just call out a few. And first is keep doing that internal work. Like check out those resources and think about how racism, how white supremacy has played out in your own life. Think about how you can expand your feed. Find Black, Indigenous, and people of color leaders and organizations and follow them. You know, listen to what Black people are saying in this moment. Listen with curiosity and listen with openness. And then share what you're hearing with white people in your lives who may not have those voices in their daily lives. Think about not just going to a protest if you're able to in this time of COVID, but could you invite a couple friends to go with you to a protest? Could you bring white folks along and bring them to the fight as well? Could you donate to bail funds or to organizations led by Black, Indigenous, or POC folks? And then finally, and most critically in some ways in this moment, is find out who is leading the work on police reform and police abolition in your community and find a way to get involved. And I hope if you take one thing away from this, it's that there isn't one right way to be involved. The important thing is really that we choose one thing and do it, and then another, and then another. And we've got to keep doing another thing for a while to come, because this isn't going to be over when the media attention turns away from George Floyd and from the protests. And we as white folks have to find ways to keep engaging and keep doing that next thing.
No, thank you so much, Ian. And I think that is my observation on, the relatively little time that I've been involved in this work, is that what I have noticed is that the privilege that I have as a white person sets me up almost automatically to not understand the depth of the problem and to disengage despite my sort of best intentions and as much as I put my willpower on it. Which is why I think this notion of accountability that was brought up at the town hall last week is so important. So I wanted to turn to that for a minute. This notion of LGBTQ movement accountability. There was the letter, which many folks have seen, I suspect, a May 29th letter titled LGBTQ Organizations Unite to Combat Racial Violence, and over 500 organizations have signed. So I want to read a piece from the letter here. And then sort of reflect on how we connect this with that sense of movement accountability. So that it says this, quote, "Many of our organizations have made progress in adopting intersectionality as a core value and have committed to be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. This moment requires that we go further, that we make explicit commitments to embrace anti-racism and end white supremacy, not as necessary corollaries to our mission, but as integral to the objective of full equality for LGBTQ people," unquote. Now, at the meeting last week, the Black Lives Matter Town Hall, attorney Michelle Rayner Goolsby responded with this. She said, "That's nice, but what are the action items? How are you going to really begin to look internally, to look at the bias or racism you may have and interrogate that and do the work?" So I think that's that piece about where the statements move to actions, and how do we think about accountability or our movement so that we can make sure that we don't fall off on the action, as you talk about, Ian, as the context invariably will change. So Mary, I'd like to turn it back to you to talk a little bit about that notion of movement accountability.
Sure thing. Thank you for that. What can I say? I think Michelle Rayner Goolsby nailed it. I agree that this is the work. It's, as she put it, the internal interrogation and listening and action. 1 + 2 + 3. I know there's a lot of nuances there. So like, how do we do the work? This is not a training, but like, there's some things that I think would be kind of obvious, or that we should be considering on the internal side, that the work requires deep engagement on both the personal level and the organizational level, and that's what's going to enrich and inform the actions. And obviously, the white people in organizations have to be talking very deeply with the Black, Indigenous, and POC people in the organizations, in our offices and beyond. And for organizations that have been historically white, even if they're not white-led, we're really going to need to work this through and be working very hard on looking at how our organizations, systems, and behaviors either are or are not part of ending white supremacy, with a pretty fearless inventory and examination. We can do an awful lot, I think, better in lifting up and focusing on Black and POC experiences and leadership and voices. If I could switch to the external side for a second, it's like all of the above. And how do we think about what is our work? How do we choose priorities? And when we do work, how do we do it? And how do we talk about it? And these are things that Alfonso David lifted up in last week's forum as well. And I have to say, when I look at this, when I think about this list of questions, I don't imagine this list ever going away. I don't know how we can't, that we're going to have to just keep asking and answering these questions to keep ourselves true to the goals. Many of us, I think, want to take action now. Sometimes that's like maybe a little bit of a failing to get too action focused. And like I say, I understand that the deep work, personal work has to happen, but action is also a point of accountability. And I hope that there are ways to proceed in tandem. And in particular, I do want to lift up also the forum last week and the specific request for our LGBTQ organizations to step up on policing. And I personally hope that every single one of our organizations will think about what we can do and how we can engage on policing, for the obvious reasons and the harms, and also because policing affects directly murders of trans women of color. So yes, the usual consult broadly, but I think there is very good news in that there are many opportunities. There are many excellent initiatives in place, many incredible analyses, and organizations can choose different ones and different paths, but there are many things underway where we can lean in and support these efforts. I also want to note that everybody at the town hall last week was very clear that policing is like the tip of the control, but it's not the only manifestation of white supremacy. Every system is affected by it. Economic system, education system, healthcare, we know these things. The thing is that when I think about our LGBTQ organizations, many of us are working on some of these issues. And I really believe that in addition to policing, that if we work in partnership with and in close consultation with our Black, Indigenous, and POC allies, we can make a contribution to this work. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, Mary. We are just after 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So I think we will move to a close, towards a close. And as folks have said throughout, this certainly is not really the beginning of a conversation nor the end of a conversation, is our hope. So please, stay in touch through organizations, personally, et cetera, however makes sense. We hope that the resources that we'll apply at the end are helpful, point of departure for some, place to continue for others, certainly not the end for any of us. But as we move towards close, Monica, I want to turn it back to you if you could just offer some sort of closing thoughts to move us towards a wrap up.
Sure, thanks, May. So our LGBTQ communities know what vigilance is. We all know that pride is still a riot. We know how to sustain our fight for liberation. And as white people, we can do our work by not waiting to recognize racism and white supremacy when we have the time or energy to act. I've just been seeing so many posts from BIPOC people who are hoping and counting on us to not burn out, lose focus, and disengage. So I'm so grateful to get to join you in continuing on this journey to do our work to really address white supremacy and go after racism. So here's one immediate thing on top of all the other things we've talked about tonight you can do is, if you haven't watched the LGBTQ Black Lives Matter Town Hall, do it. It's on Equality Florida's YouTube channel, and you can share it with your friends. And there's a link in the video description here too, and some resources that you can use for ways to take action. And then as you hop off, and as we all hop off, let's all think about one thing we can do this week, and then let's do it, and let's keep fighting the fight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you all soon.